We'll call the meeting to order. Roll call.
Okay, Mayor Westergaard.
Yep.
Holtman.
Yep.
Cleveland.
Yes.
Reese.
Here.
Stankin.
Here.
And Councilor Huss will be absent.
Tonight we're gonna go over the facility plan review. Bob?
Thank you, Your Honor, members of council. What I'd like to do is I've given you a handout. It's sort of a you don't have to look at it now, but it's just sort of some question and answer kind of things that maybe you'll think about afterwards. First question you're gonna ask, why are we here? Why are we doing a facility plan? Several months ago, the city got its new NPDES operating permit for the wastewater plant. And the state's imposed a new standard. We have to disinfect our wastewater, so we have to do something to get the bacteria that go onto the treatment plant. We have to kill those off before we can put that water back in the stream. It's a new requirement. Every treatment plant in Iowa, pretty much, there's a couple of exceptions, but almost every treatment plant that doesn't now disinfect will be required to disinfect. And so in the permit, they include a compliance schedule. It says, okay, we'll give you some time to come into compliance. In your case, it's until May of 2017. So that's how long you have. Well, they start the process off with what's called a facility plan. And if you look in their rules, they tell you what has to be included in the facility plan. But it's basically a study to outline what it is you're going to do, how much it's going to cost, how you're going to pay for it, and when you're going to do it. Now, we could have taken the very narrow approach of saying we're going to do a facility plan just for the disinfection. But if you're familiar with the treatment plant, there's some things out there that are getting old, kind of like me, and wearing out. And so the thought was it would make sense to take a comprehensive look at the treatment plant. Now, as we go through the facility plan, I think it's important to recognize there are really two kinds of improvements. And we refer to them as phase 1 and phase 2. Phase 1 is what's necessary to meet the permit limits for disinfection. Phase 2, we've identified a number of improvements based on the physical condition of the treatment plant. At this time, you're not obligated to do those improvements. You could decide you're not going to do any of them. You could decide you're going to do some of them. You could decide you want to do all of them. The reason we thought it would make sense to put them all in the facility plan is so that the council can get a kind of a big picture look at it and decide going forward how you want to address that. You do not need to decide right now what you're going to do in phase 2. You can kind of, I'm going to say, kick that ball down the road for a couple of years. But I thought it made sense to go over them, because if you don't get a good picture of it, then something could come up that you weren't expecting. There are some things out at the treatment plant that are not likely to last more than a few more years. So if you do something and you decide you don't want to do everything, and you decide, let's say, I don't want to do anything in phase 2, understand that probably at some point down the road, there are going to be some things that are going to come get you. Now, several of you have turned to the colored drawing. I just want to kind of go over a little bit. This is kind of an age diagram of the treatment plant. And so I want to talk a little bit about the history of the treatment plant, because the history of the treatment plant really governs some of the things we're talking about. Your treatment plant was built in the 1930s, and it was a classical 1930s treatment plant. The big yellow thing, the north trickling filter, is really the last remaining piece from the 1930s treatment plant. So that thing is 80 years old. And typically on a trickling filter, the tank might last 60, 70 years. You've done some work on the inside, but the basic tank has had water spraying against that concrete for 80 years, and the concrete's wearing out. And if you look at it, my guess is that sometime between now and, pick a number, 2020, something catastrophic is going to happen to that trickling filter. I think that's probably the number one thing, because it's also the oldest thing at the treatment plant. It's also very critical, because that's the part that really helps you meet the ammonia limit which is the other part of your permit. Now, you have ammonia limits, you have them now, you'll have them in the future. You're not being cited for violations, although we've kind of danced on the edge a few times. But if something were to happen to that trickling filter, you would be out of compliance with your permit limits fairly quickly. So the yellow thing, the yellow trickling filter, and in the last improvement project that was done in about 2000, 2001, you took out the inside, you put in, instead of rocks, you put in plastic media, you put a new distributor on it. So you kind of reworked it, but the basic structure is still from 1930s. Well, in the 1930s treatment plant, the flow used to come in the same way it does now in from the sewer, but it used to go all the way across over to right next to the yellow tank and get pumped into a thing called an Imhoff tank. Well, what's happened over the years is that instead of going right to that pumping station and then get pumped into the Imhoff tank and the trickling filter, we've added all kinds of stuff into the front end of the treatment plant. We've added a grit chamber, we've added a flume, we've added a primary clarifier over the years, and there's really not much elevation. And every one of those units takes some elevation, takes a little bit of watt. You know what it's like in a stream. Every time you put an impediment in it, it takes a little bit of fall to get past it. Well, it's the same thing here. So one of the things you have is you don't have any pumping coming into the treatment plant, which was what you used to do back in the day, when you used to just go in there once. But you used to pump, way back in the 30s, you pumped once into the treatment plant. Well, what they've done is they've kind of kept stuffing things in front of it. And so if you look at the front end of the treatment plant, the front end, the water or the hydraulics of the treatment plant doesn't work very well because you've got this very flat sewer. So what happens is it doesn't get through the flume and the grit removal right. Water tends to stand a little bit in the sewer, so you get grit and other material falling out, building up in the sewer. It doesn't improve the hydraulics. So the front end of the treatment plant is very flat. It's cheap in the sense that you don't have to pump, but it doesn't work very well. And it's been a complaint that I've heard however many years I've been coming out here. It's like, okay, the front end of the treatment plant doesn't work very well. This pipe is flat, or this pipe is flat. Well, basically, it's to the point the whole front of the plant is too flat. And what you're doing is if I move this pipe or that pipe or this pipe, it sort of reminds me of shuffling the deck chairs on the Titanic. You get a better view, but you really aren't solving the underlying problem. And so we've got some issues there. The next thing we're going to talk about is the grit removal. That was a new unit that was put in as a part of the 2000 improvement. And what grit is it's like sand and heavy material, and it's inert, it's not organic. And so the idea is you want to settle it out, because you don't want to have to get all that stuff in the treatment plant, because it doesn't go anywhere. It just settles out and sits. Well, the grit removal unit includes, it's a circular tank, and it kind of accumulates the grit. And there's a equipment that takes that out and supposedly what they call classify and segregate that grit, so you can take it and haul it to the landfill. That equipment has never really worked. And so the staff has not used that grit removal unit since it was put in. So what's happened is you end up with grit in the primary clarifier. It just kind of goes right on through and fills the next unit up. It would be best in the long term if we could get the grit removal unit working. There's nothing really wrong with the grit, the circular tank. The problem is it's the equipment that handles the grit. It doesn't work. Pain in the rear. And such a pain in the rear, they turn it off. They just kind of bypass it. Is that a fair?
Plugs the pipe.
Yeah,
It
just doesn't work.
plugs the pipe,
Just
and it won't
doesn't
suck
work.
it up.
Now, in 2000, that was a okay piece of equipment. They've got a lot newer kinds because they've discovered that grit's kind of nasty stuff. It's kind of like really dirty sand. It's like taking the sand off the street in the spring and mixing it with some sewage. Not the best stuff in the world to deal with, especially right around dinner time when you don't want to talk about it. So you've probably all eaten, I haven't, so that's why I never eat till after council meetings, so I don't know what I can talk about that stuff. So I think some new grit removal equipment would be in order. That's, you could live without that. We could probably live without the first one we just talked about, of what to do with the hydraulics. The flume itself is probably okay. It was kind of hybridized in there to make it fit, but it seems to be okay. The primary clarifier is the next thing. It's a square, it's a rectangular tank, and I think you've had some issues with it. I think it periodically breaks. It's wearing out. It's inside a building, and that's kind of unusual, but the reason they do that is to conserve heat, because in your treatment units, the trickling filters, the warmer the sewage is, the better the bugs grow in the winter. Bugs are like you and I, they'd be warm and toasty in the winter. And so when the water gets cold, they don't like it. And so that if you just put a rectangular tank out there kind of exposed to the atmosphere, guess what happens? It cools off. The water temperature cools off 3 or 4 degrees. And so by the time you get over the trickling filters, it's even cooler, and so it doesn't do a very good job. Your trickling filters do an amazingly good job, and part of that is because you don't lose much heat through the treatment plant, and part of that's the primary clarifier because it's covered. But the downside of a primary clarifier being covered is a very moist environment. So it's been out there now since about 1970. So it's got, what, 44 years on it? Typical life of that kind of clarifier is about 30 to 40 years. So you can see we're getting out toward borrowed time. That one, at some point in the next few years, something's going to break, and it's probably not going to be really fixable. The other problem with the primary clarifier goes back to the grit removal, is that you end up all the grit going in there, and there's mechanisms in there that kind of scrape out the solids. Because what the primary clarifier does is it takes out the heavy stuff in the sewage, settles it down so you can go treat it. So tell me when to stop if I'm getting too deep into that. But it takes the heavy stuff. Well, there's a scraper mechanism that scrapes that stuff off the bottom, because you don't want to go down there and scrape it off. So there's a mechanical thing that scrapes it off. Well, when you get all this grit and other stuff that didn't come out in the grit removal unit, that just bogs it down. So it just makes it worse. So the grit removal, the primary clarifier, I think, we probably need to do something in the next few years. We'll go to the next picture and look at that here in a minute. Then we go to the trickling filters. The old trickling filter that was built in the 1930s, it's beyond its useful life. There's really not much you can do to patch that one up. It needs to be replaced. The south one, which was built in the 1970s, still got another 20 years in it. Could use a little work, some rehab, maybe help it out a little bit, but I don't think you're going to spend a lot of money on it because you got other places to go. Then we go to the final clarifiers, kind of the 2 purple circles. They were done as a part of the 2000 improvements. We did a little bit of work a few years ago on it, kind of isolate them. They're in really good shape. We now go back over to the digester, which is the other circular thing. The digester, it's like the big ultimate crock pot for sewage. So all this organic material that we collect has biological capabilities. So it's like putting it in the crock pot and simmering it. Well, when you simmer it, you break it down. It's kind of like thickening up your chili or soup or whatever. So you kind of thicken it up. And so we cook that stuff up for 30 or 40 days. We heat it all up and we cook it down, make a nice, not something you want to eat, but it's just,
Nice bowl of chili.
it's really, how you get it all thickened up and almost burnt,
Sure, there's a little chili in there.
This thing Gus ain't even on it. Can't blame him.
The tank itself, the concrete tank is actually in pretty good shape. But all of the equipment, all the pipes, the valves, and all the things that go with it are now, 45 years old, and they're wearing out. And you've had some problems with them. You've blown out some pipes and stuff.
We just busted one the other day, a bell, so.
Yeah, so I mean, it's what it is it's the tank itself is probably got enough life in it, but it needs to be torn down, basically stripped down and rebuilt with all new pipes, valves, equipment. If you do that, you can get another 20 or so years out of it, 20, 30 years out of the tank. If you don't, things are gonna continue to break, and it's just gonna be a difficult adventure. The loading tank and some of those things, the other purple things that were built, actually in not bad shape. The control building could use some work, but we're not gonna put a lot of focus on that. The other thing, there's a couple of things that are left over from the 2000 project that got abandoned that they just leave out there. Those things probably should be knocked down and made to go away. Not a big deal about it. So that's kind of an overview of the improvement plan. And so what we've done is we've created an improvement program. And if you go to the next one, and this is what we've shown in orange is the disinfection. And what we're going to propose is that ultraviolet disinfection. You can do two ways. You can either use ultraviolet light to zap the bugs, basically use ultraviolet light and you blow the bugs up from inside out. So in other words, you put enough, it's kind of like your microwave, you put energy in there and you basically burst their cell walls with this light. So they get all energized inside and they blow up. It's the end of the bug. So the other one is that you put chlorine in there and you basically oxidize it. You know how it is when you put chlorine like bleach down, you basically get rid of the algae and all that stuff. You basically oxidize the cell walls. You can use either way. Chlorine, you have to always be dealing with handling the chlorine. In other words, you always have to put a chlorine solution in it. The other challenge is that, not here yet, but at some point, and there are parts of the state, cities that chlorinate, there are regulations for how much chlorine can remain in the water. And so sometimes you have to go in and add another process called dechlorination. And so dechlorination has another chemical. So you chlorinate and dechlorinate. Ultraviolet disinfection is a little bit more costly to build, but you have very cheap electric power compared with most cities. And so when you look at your power cost versus the chemical cost to buy and handle chlorine, if you have very high power costs, sometimes the chlorination looks good. If you've got really average or below average power costs, then the UV disinfection is best. The disinfection doesn't require much monitoring. You don't have to be horsing around with the chemicals. Basically, the light bulbs are on, the light bulbs are off. They stay out there. You have to disinfect 9 months out of the year. When it comes winter, you don't have to disinfect because, in theory, what are we protecting? We're protecting people falling in the stream. Well, in December, January, and February, theoretically, the number of people splashing around in the creek are down significantly, so they don't make us zap the bugs. Come March, they say you're back playing in the stream, so we got to do that now. I don't play in the creek in March. I don't play in the creek in July, but you know. So it's a much simpler operation for your operation where you don't have somebody there all the time, just kind of checking in on the treatment plant. UV disinfection is a good thing. It's preferable. We'll put a little storage building there where we can store the bulbs, because in the wintertime we'll take the bulbs out and we'll put them in storage. You have another issue while we clean up while we're there, is that you have a sampler. In other words, we have to sample all the time. We have to sample the sewage so we can test it. Well, when they built the clarifiers, they put the sampler over in the administration building, and they have its pipe or tube where they basically suck the sample all the way over from the clarifiers over there. Well, this pipe is always sitting full of sewage. It's treated, but it's still sewage. And so what it has a tendency to do is to build up biological material in there, which then you have to clean this line out. So it's always purging it and flushing it and cleaning it. So what we'll do is that as a part of this, we'll relocate that sampler down to the little storage building for the UV equipment. So we eliminate that long suction line, and that way we've got a sampler right there. So in the process, we've cleaned up what is kind of an operational headache from the 2000 improvement. Doesn't cost us really anything because we've got to move the sampling location over anyway. We got to put a little storage building for the equipment, so we'll just put it there, run some power out there, and we can do that. So that's the phase 1 improvements. Again, the phase 1 improvements have to be done by March or basically May 1 of 2017. But the DNR actually gives you more dates. So they actually give you a series of dates, and by March 1 of next year, you have to be under design, you have to complete the design by December, award the contract so construction could start in early 2016 and be done by the spring of 2017. Doesn't take that long to build it. And it's interesting because sometimes they'll tell you they give you 18 months to build a $20 million project, and here they're giving you 15 months, 16 months to build a $500,000 project. So we need to stay on that compliance schedule, and so that next date coming up for actually doing something would be March 1st. Now, we need to get the facility plan in by basically the end of this week. They'll review it, and then we'll move into the next step. I want to talk a little bit about timing-wise. That project is going to overlap with what our existing debt is that we have out there for the 2000 improvement. That gets paid off in 2020. So $500,000, if we borrow the money in the state revolving fund loan program, I'll round it to $500,000. By the time you go through it, it's probably going to be in that range. It's a little over 6 cents a year for a dollar you borrow. So if you borrow $500,000, it's a little over $30,000 a year. Right now, you don't quite generate enough revenue to do that, so you need to look at some rate increases. You have some flexibility because that first debt service payment won't be until 17, so it's 2.5 years, almost, not quite 3 years from now. So you will have to have a little rate increase in order to handle that, but it doesn't, you know, your rates are probably a little bit below average right now, so you need probably about a 14% rate increase over the next 3 years in order to accommodate that. If you want to do that and just stop with that, that's where you are. But we also think you ought to at least look at some of the other improvements. And what I've kind of shown is a low-head pumps. Let's go back to the kind of the phase 2. You can stay on that drawing, phase 2 improvements. What I'm showing what we're doing is the phase 2 improvements. These are discretionary in that you're not required to do them, although some of them are going to probably come calling on you even if you don't come calling on them, because when something breaks, you'll have to do something. And that's generally not the time to do it, because now the trickling filter's broke, what do? I got to get it up and running. You have to spend a bunch of money to get it, cobbled together, and you still end up replacing it. So, as I indicated, these phase 2 improvements, we don't have to do all of them. I do think it will make sense to look at some of them. We threw them all in here because we wanted to have the council see the big picture, but we can talk over the next couple of years exactly what we want to do. The first thing I'm showing is a low-head pump station. And what a low-head pump station is just designed to lift the sewage up about table height. It would probably use a couple little Archimedes screw pumps. If you're familiar with the old Egyptian screw pumps, basically just go round and round, lift the water up. They just run and run and run. Very low maintenance. Don't need a screen or anything in front of them because they'll grind up anything that gets down there. 2x4 or anything, they'll just grind them up and take them on through. So they're very, very forgiving. They're the oldest pump out there. They're the least maintenance pump. They just run and run and run. You can put they're small, you can put a little cover over them so we don't lose any heat. That would really free up and solve all of the front end hydraulic problems that we've been sort of chasing around probably since 1970. The next thing we do is we're suggesting you replace the grit handling equipment. Not the unit, but basically all the stuff that takes the grit and processes it. Use a system now that doesn't plug, doesn't splash, doesn't dump water all over everywhere, and so that would work. There's 2 or 3 different systems that are available. Haven't made any kind of decision on which one to do, to look at. Have included a cost allowance for that in there. Primary clarifiers are really the next thing. We have 1 primary clarifier today in the state. Won't let you have 1, you gotta have 2, because they have to have reliability. The same way you used to have 1 final clarifier when you built the improvements in 2000, 2001, you had to build 2. The same way you used to have 1 trickling filter, and when you built the improvements in 1970, you had to have 2. So today, for any treatment unit, you gotta have 2. So we don't really have much choice. If we want to replace the primary clarifier, we have to do 2. So we're showing 2 of them. We're then showing replacement of the north trickling filter, the 1930s trickling filter. I think you want to stay with the treatment process you have, even though it's just going to be costly to do. It is the least costly to run. It's also the least costly to build. You may think this project is costly, but I can tell you I'm working with a community your same size who's replacing their treatment plant with a new, fancier activated sludge treatment plant. Their project is costing $6.7 million for the same population. So sewage is getting costly. So I think, long run, I like this kind of treatment process. You won't find many people that use it today. There are only about, I don't know, just in 20, 25 trickling filter plants left in the state. You've got to be, shows my age. I actually learned on trickling filters when I was in school, but I learned on a slide rule too. So today's kids don't really, we don't really teach them today, but it is a really basic, good treatment technology. The reason yours works, this is a stroke of accident. Back in the 1930s, they used to build trickling filters a little deeper than they did later. And what happens is that when the water gets in there, there's two kinds of things that get treated. One is the carbon-based, anything that has a carbon, which would be organic. There's certain bugs that like the carbon-based waste, and they're very aggressive, so they grow first. They grow, and they're very aggressive. They take out all the carbon, all the, basically, anything that's organic. There's also nitrogen-based, like ammonia and TCAN. Nitrogen's a byproduct that humans can't avoid it. There are certain bugs that use the nitrogen as their food source. They're called Nitrus amonis and Nitrobacter. They're very lazy. They're very good, but they're not very aggressive. And so they don't like to compete with the other bugs. And so the other bugs have to do their thing, and then when it's all done, there's got to be space left to grow these Nitrus amonis and Nitrobacter. Your trickling filters are deep enough so that you've got space between the two of them, probably not much in the first one, but a lot in the second one, the one that's the older one. That you've got space after you've taken out all the carbon waste to grow the Nitrus amonis and Nitrobacter in a good enough population that'll stay through the winter. And so you're very fortunate. If we replace the filter, we'll want to go just a little deeper because we want to encourage that growth of ammonia bacteria, the Nitrus amonis and Nitrobacter. But I would strongly encourage the council to consider staying with the technology. It costs you about a quarter to run the cost to run the treatment plant if you were to go to an activated sludge treatment plant where we'd have to have all kinds of mechanical blowers and stuff like this. Here, all of the treatment occurs just by gravity. You pump it up there once, gravity spins a distributor around, it goes through there, it aerates from the air naturally ventilating from the temperature differential, so you don't have to go in and put all kinds of artificial aeration in it. So I like it. I grew up with it back in the day, and we still have a number of clients that have it, and if you've got one, hang on to it. You're fortunate because in 1970, you got just ahead of when the state got really clamped down on trickling filter plants. Had you built your 1970 improvement 5 years later, I almost guarantee you wouldn't have a trickling filter plant today, because they all but abolished them in the 1970s. And then sort of let them come back. So you got just got by. In other words, by 1974, they pretty much outlawed trickling filters because the popular wisdom at that day was they don't work. They don't take out ammonia. They do, as evidence. So the ones that kept them are in really good shape. But I think the trickling filter is probably the #1 priority. We're also showing some rehabbing of the digester. That's sort of the arrow there that's kind of leading over to that. That needs to be worked out, and there's a couple other things. So again, it's kind of a once over. We're keeping, if you notice that almost everything that was really done, with the exception of the grid handling equipment, we're not really touching anything from the 2000 improvement project. We've got one glitch we got to clean up, which is the grid handling. Other than that, what we're really focusing in on is the things that are left over from the 1930 and 1970 improvement, because they're now either 45 or 85 years old. and it's time that they need a once-over. Again, we want to do a complete overview of it. If you go back in kind of the handout, I think, so you don't have to wander through it, I've given you kind of an estimate of it. If you look at you look on page 2 in the middle of the page, that's just kind of an estimate of cost on a project cost basis. Again, the 480,000-ish for the disinfection, I don't think you have much choice on. The other list of improvements that are about 3.5 million, you do have a fair degree of flexibility. You can decide, you don't have to do everything, you can put some off, you can do some, not do some. We think that's all the things that you need out there at the treatment plant for the next 20 years. Now, as soon as I say that, something else will break, but that's just my luck. But by going through the facility plan, and we debated whether to include them in the facility plan or not include them in the facility plan. By including them in the facility plan, they're approved. If you want to go forward, you can go forward with them. But you're not obligated to go forward with them. So you can decide to pull the plug, a year from now or whenever it is. If you don't include them in the facility plan and you decide you need to do something, you've got to go back and do a facility plan and start over. So it didn't really cost anything more to put them in. You can always say, I'm not obligated to do that, we'll do that in other times. So that's kind of where we're sitting. What we did is we took a look at what are the implications of doing them as one big phase 2. Now, the issue really becomes the cost. Now, you've got an existing loan that's paid off in 2020. The schedule we're suggesting for the phase 2 improvements, to whatever you decide to do, would be to start construction of those in the fall of 2017 or early 2018. Finish them up in 2019. And the first principal payment would be in 2020. We also think that you can save up enough money between now and then to pay off that last 2020 principal payment. So you essentially put your savings, pay off that debt so you don't have overlapping debt service. Because we're only talking about one payment, we can do that. If you were 5 or 10 years, you couldn't do that. So where we are schedule-wise, we think there's a schedule that you could do a phase 2 project and do it so it really doesn't end up with overlapping debt. You'd be getting rid of one debt payment right when the new one is kicking in. So it really becomes not of an overlap, it's more about how much do you want to accommodate for raising rates. We've given you an example that if you did everything your rate today, which is about, for a user of 4,000 gallons, is $29.16, would have to go up to about $50 by 2020. Now, you're just going to go up regardless of what we do just because of inflation, so we've tried to build some of that in. If you do half of that, you can just proportion the difference. It'd be probably in the $40 range. So we can decide at some point over the next while where you want to go with that. So we wanted, not asking you for a final decision tonight, we just wanted to kind of present it. What we'd like to do is, if the council's agreeable, at least submit the facility plan. The next step in the process, as I indicated earlier, you need to do something with the improvements to disinfection. I'm assuming you're going to fund this through the state revolving fund loan program because there's nothing better out there. Right now, for a 20-year loan, it's 2% interest. You can't borrow money at 2% anywhere, unless you're really good. But even in today's market, I don't think you can borrow money at 2%.
Well, maybe not anymore. But
And this would be revenue and not GO. And it's just going to be even more So if you were to sell revenue bonds today, you'd probably be in the 3.5% range if you're lucky. They also have another program called the Planning and Design Loan. And one of the things they struggle with is that cities oftentimes don't have the money to do the design of the improvements, and they don't want to enter into the construction loan before they build it, because then you incur interest and all of those things. So the state has a program where you can borrow money for up to 3 years at 0% interest to cover what's called the planning and design loan. So any part of the improvements that you think you want to move forward with, you can do the design part as a part of a planning and design loan. Doesn't cost you anything, you roll that into the construction loan, and it'll just become a part of the construction of the long-term loan. So it's like if you're gonna build a house and you're gonna go to the bank and you need a construction loan, a bridge loan, it's like the bank are giving it to you for a while at 0% interest. So there's not much better out there. There is a schedule for the planning and design loan, and that is they update those, you have to be on the list. They update that list every quarter. The next submittal date is January 2nd. So if you submit a planning and design loan by January 2nd, you'll actually go on the intended use plan list in March, and you can close the planning and design loan in April. So it actually fits fairly well with when you need to start design, which should be March 1st. You can do it any time ahead of it, but frankly, at this point, you probably won't. Now, even if you decide to start some of the design work ahead of time, you can pay for that out of it. You've got some reserve funds, and then as soon as the loan closes, you can get reimbursed. So you don't have, the loan doesn't have to be in place and finalized to be eligible for the cost. So let's say you don't get the loan till April and you incurred $1,000 in design costs in March or April, you can pay that from the reserves in the sewer fund and pay yourself back as soon as the loan closes. So it's actually a pretty flexible tool. What you could do, if you want to, if you can kind of get an idea what it is you think you want to build, you could get one planning and design loan to cover both phase 1 and phase 2, because it would roll into the construction loan within 3 years. Because if you get the loan in April of 2015, you would have until about the spring of 2018 to go to construction on whatever phase 2 looks like. So it probably makes sense, if you're going to identify a phase 2, that you go ahead and do one planning and design loan. Now, you're not required to decide, you're not required to use all of the planning and design loan. It's a drawdown loan. So you ask for whatever it is that you think you might need, and you can use up to that amount. You're not required to use it. Whatever you don't use, they just don't charge you. They don't put it in the construction loan. So it's like, doesn't cost you anything. So if you want to do something, you always, when you're putting in an application for a planning and design loan, kind of, there's no drawback whatsoever to say, if I'm thinking about doing everything, might as well just decide we're going to put an application in for that amount. You decide 6 months from now you don't want to do part of it, you don't want to go incur the cost for design, you simply don't draw the loan down. So it's a pretty flexible program. It's the best one out there. It's really taken over and monopolized the wastewater financing. Nobody does anything else anymore. So kind of in summary, that's kind of an overview. You know, there's some things we've got to do. There's some things we think the council should do. There's some things you have some discretion whether you want to do based on rates. Those things you don't need to decide tonight. You don't need to decide immediately. In fact, you probably don't have to decide for a year or two. We will need to get the facility plan in this week in order to check the box and stay out of the doghouse. We would suggest that in one of your December meetings that you authorize a planning and design loan so we can get that application in, get that in the list so that you, by March when you have to start design, you've got that at least not finalized, but you're basically in line to get that. You'll get the notification that you'll get it. You won't technically have the paperwork. And then continue the discussion about what it is that you think you want to or can't afford. We think all of the improvements, we've tried to stay away from things that there's some other things you could recommend out there at the treatment plant, but I think some of those, given the magnitude of the cost, probably can wait a while. So we've tried to focus in on what I think are the essential core needs, but again, there's discretion. I do think the trickling filter is going to be something that does need to be done. I think the digester is probably something that is critical. If you want to kick something down the road, you could probably kick the primary clarifiers down the road, but I don't think they'll make it to the end of 20 years, so if you.
Question on that though, Bob. Would we be allowed to rehab that primary clarifier?
Yes.
Okay.
You gotta, the biggest issue with rehabbing you'd be okay to rehab the primary clarifier.
Okay.
Yeah. There's some issues with it, you might get 20 years out of it if you rehab it. Now, the question really becomes, and we'll have to check on that, is if they allow, how much rehab I can do without meeting the reliability standard.
Mhm.
Because right now it doesn't meet the reliability standard. So at some point they may say, I'm not gonna let you rehab this one without building another one. At that point then, it becomes almost self-defeating. So if you're interested in rehabbing it, we'll have to see where they are on whether they're gonna kick in the reliability standards. Yep.
But say we kick out, just say like we kick out this 384,000.
Yeah.
And then we decide we want to do that in 5 years. How much more is it going to cost in 5 years?
Yeah, what's,
I mean, what's the?
we're talking about today's dollars, what's,
We've tried to factor in costs that are out about in that time frame. So we've tried to build in some inflation in these to get out.
so this is inflation.
I've tried to look at inflation out about 2018. So nothing worse than me trying to say here's today's dollar in 3 or 4 years from now. If you look at what construction costs are right now, on average, they're going up in the wastewater business. About over the last 10 years, they've gone up about 3.5% a year. So if you're really looking at it economically, if it isn't for the phasing of the sewer rates, it doesn't really benefit you to wait, because you're paying 2% interest on improvements that are going up at 3.5%. What so economically, you're on the backside of the curve. The real driver of why you wouldn't do it now is really what you think you can tolerate for sewer rates. That's really, if the sewer rates are manageable, they're going to be lower in the long term by doing the project than it would be to, stage it out and then have to do it in series. What staging it out does is allows you to get to a higher rate over a longer period of time. So that's really that's the real issue for the council is, what are your feelings? Now, I will tell you there are some cities that when they get to a certain level of debt or of magnitude of project cost, will go ahead and say, part of this should be a general benefit to the city, and so they'll split a little bit between geo debt and revenue debt. In other words, we're going to say, we'll put a little bit of it on the geo debt, put it on the ad valorem tax levy, you've got the debt capacity, tends to keep the sewer rates down a little bit, does spread, you're still paying for it, but it kind of spreads it out a little bit over a different tax base. That's really your discretion, don't need to decide that today, but and Scott and I haven't even talked about that. So, a city that has a lot of debt capacity, that's something that they can look at if they want to temper the rates. I'm working with a community right now that has no debt, and they're going to do a major improvement project. If they don't do anything, they'll have no debt service and sky-high sewer rates. And so the council there is saying, probably, we're building in some growth capacity, we're doing some things, so it probably makes sense to spread that out. They've got a nice enough commercial tax base that it actually does shift the load around a little bit. So it's I'm not recommending it, I'm just saying that if you say that that the rates are a little bit too high, but we'd like to do it, some cities would say, okay, we'll kind of balance the financing a little bit. So again, we can have more discussion about that. We don't need to decide that. I wanted to give it to you tonight so we can start the dialogue. I'm sure that from an operational perspective, I don't think there's anything in there that we didn't think was needed. It's just a matter of kind of, can you talk, what is the rate tolerance? Yeah.
Well, I've been down to this grit removal we got down here and it hasn't worked since we built it.
Yeah.
So if we do this again and we get something that doesn't work, we're stuck paying for something that ain't worth a crap.
I will tell you that we'll show you, we'll take you to show you the systems. Anything we propose, we want you to be comfortable with it, so we'll go look at it, make sure that it works.
Because we have a history of saving $5,000, and then 5 years later, we spent $50,000 to fix that five. I'd
That's
like to not
why-
do that.
That's why I wanted to lay out probably everything I could see rather than cut corners at this point. I'd rather have the discussion, and if you decide you can't do something, I'd rather have that discussion. I don't think I should be the one that's telling you, okay, you don't need to do this. You can't afford it, so I'm not gonna show it to you. I think the grit removal unit is probably the one that I know has kind of been the most problematic. The others are pretty straightforward, but, you know, we want you to be, if you decide to replace the grit removal equipment, we want you to be comfortable with the system. We want you to go look at them, see them in operation. Doesn't do any good for me to tell you what really the best thing is to go see one. Go talk to the operator at another plant that has that kind of system. Learn its warts and what's good about it. There's nothing in sewage treatment that doesn't have a wart or two on it. There's no perfect sewage treatment thing.
Lon, just out of curiosity, how much do you think we spent on Band-Aid costs the last few years, just to stay compliant, I guess? Is that a fair question, or?
Well, we got the grants on the pumps, so, you know, right there was, about almost 30,000. We fixed the front end of the sewer plant when I first took over. What was that, Scott?
Oh, that-
15,000?
Yeah, that was gonna be up around 25 by the time we got all that taken
Yeah.
care of.
And
Yeah, but-
none of that's actually wasted. We'd have to do that anyway,
Yeah,
so.
yeah, and then, of course, we made it so we could shut down one of the clarifier, the final clarifiers.
Yeah.
I don't,
Yeah.
that was, you know, I
Oh, God,
finished
that was
it, but Jack had
18,000, but-
started that.
Yeah.
And then we, of course, my guys and I rebuilt the clarifier, the final clarifiers. We put new rods in the bottom this year, and then we had a new aluminum deal made, which was fairly cheap, because we did it ourselves. Of course, now, in the valving in the basement, I don't know what that company charges. Remember at Christmas time when we were,
Oh, and the digester,
Yeah,
well, in the basement?
Yeah.
Yeah, we couldn't shut it down, so.
So would it be fair to say 100,000?
It would,
I'd
it would
say
be
easy.
fair, yes.
Yep, I'd say easy.
Well, see,
I
that's,
just spent another 10,000 down there last week, so.
it's not nickel diamond, it's another $1,
Yeah.
$50 to that, so. I guess what I'm saying is, where I'm going is that this is the 2% money is important. Because I don't think it's gonna get any cheaper. And I don't know what it's gonna be. How long does a loan like this, I mean, how long do you think this interest will stay like this, would you say, in your?
this is as low as it's been since the program started in 1989. You know, I would guess it'll stay there for a while, and then, you know, what the tendency is when interest rates go back up, you know, in the general marketplace, they'll drift back up again.
How high have you seen them?
4.5 in this program.
Okay, I'm just trying to.
I think ours, when we did it in 2000, started out at 3.5 is where it started out.
Yeah, it's 4.5 is the highest. it's
And then it does go down when rates go down.
Depends on the age of the loan.
After 10 years, yeah, you're right.
And that isn't always the case. Some adjustments, they'll let you go after 10 years, some they won't let you go. There's some loans out there that they won't readjust, so.
Huh.
I don't think, I think the answer is, it's not likely to get cheaper. You know, are there other states out there that are a little cheaper? Yeah, there are some of the surrounding states that are a little cheaper, but they've always been. Every state gets to set their own program. Iowa hasn't been the bottom dollar for interest rates, but they've got from an availability of money to serve cities in Iowa, the best program in the Midwest. I mean, we're working with Missouri, and it's like you gotta go in there and scrap, and not everybody gets the money. So far in Iowa, they've never had to turn anybody down. They've always had the money for it. So yeah, you pay a little bit more interest, you know, in Missouri it's 1 3/4, in Nebraska it's 2 1/4, Illinois it's 1 1/2. My memory serves me right, so they're all in there.
correct me if I'm wrong now, when you're talking, we're just talking sewer rates, not water rates.
Right.
That's
correct.
That's right, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Water
Yes.
rates would remain the same, but yeah, you know,
You want to talk through that just a little bit, Bob, about, what this was saying was, what did this say, 12.5% for 5 years? If you look at a multi-year type of staging of rates.
I think you want to avoid one big rate increase.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you have to stage it out, a couple, $3 a year, every year out
Right.
to 2020, may not be desirable, but it's much better than the alternative. I keep saying that, but I remember working with the client community I remember the first time they raised their rates in 40 years, they increased them by 500%. Nobody complained, but it's like, I don't think that's the norm.
No.
No.
One of the things though that you can do is that you can make this public of what we've got to spend towards this.
Right.
We can kind of train the public a little bit or give information that
Sure.
we're not doing this just so Lon can go have a keg someplace,
Yeah, and if you start on a phased rate increase, you'll save some money over that 5-year period. Whatever money you save, some of that you could pay off the existing loan with. You can buy down the existing loans, so the new loans, so we're not borrowing as much money. So there's lots of things you can do. But I put in the rate increase every year from 15 to 20 because I think that's the most popular and most acceptable way of doing it. And you can explain to people. What we found is that most citizens are willing to understand that if the rate increase is for something. What's
Right.
most difficult is when I'm just saying, I don't really have a plan, but I'm gonna raise the rates anyway. Well, I got clients that do that, yeah. I don't need the
Well, by
money.
doing so, raising the rates, a little bit, per year, we're actually saving the taxpayers' dollars in the long run.
Yeah.
So I guess with that in mind, it's just really a no-brainer, if you look to the future, with the sewer plant, so.
It's not gonna get any younger or any better.
Right.
So I guess is what I'm saying is that we might as well try to put the whole package in there for a design plan.
Right.
And then we can, as we move along, at least we know what's going on. We know we got a plan if we have to go with this, and then we'll have to see what goes down the road. Because it's no bigger deal than, it's kind of doing it half-assed if we don't do it that way, right?
Yeah. I mean, if you're going down the road, you can always say at some point in time, maybe that one I can't really do. You can always pull it out, but you can't really go back. If you're going halfway, you can't really go back and say, oops, I'd really like to put that one in. You can't really go back and grab it and add it back in, so.
I guess that's what would been my question is, what would you recommend?
My suggestion right now is to go forward as if you're gonna do it all. And then you can always, if you
Yeah,
need
like
to,
Whitey said.
if you need to pull your horns, pull it back a little bit, you always add that flexibility. But you can't add. You can always, back out of it if you have to. So for example, you decide, I really, maybe I've got to do something. Maybe that influent pump station, maybe I really need to cut back a little bit. Maybe I can live without that because we've lived without that for a number of years. That's not as bad as, the digester or trickling filter. So, maybe you say, we can put that off for a little bit. Some of the ones I don't think you're gonna be able to put off.
Got a feeling usually when we get into these projects that, we gotta do it.
Yeah.
Because we get into, that's, because once you get into something, there always seems to be something that's not just quite.
will these be a parallel or series then?
Series and parallel, you can do either way.
You can go either way.
We think normally, the question is, can you run the trickling filters in series or parallel, side by side, or one right after the other? With the limits that you have now, normally I would suggest you run them one right after the other or in series because you get more of one kind of treatment in the first one and more of another kind of treatment in the second one. That's not to say that if I have in wet weather periods when my flows are real high, that I might not want to run them, particularly in the warm weather period, I could run them side by side. So you have that flexibility to run them either
Which
way.
we don't have now.
You were supposed to have, so Yeah, you don't, but you're supposed to have, so we gotta get that.
Yeah.
It can be done. When we repipe the things, that can be taken care of.
But everything in your plan is stuff that needs to be done.
I think so, but you know,
Bottom
again, I'm
line.
not, I don't wanna be so dogmatic as to tell you that you don't have the discretion to not do some of it, because you're not mandated to do everything.
Not yet.
So,
Until it falls apart.
Yeah, then it costs,
Then we're mandated.
then we're stuck.
my question on this, again, population growth. We have an influx of people. What is this set up to handle? What, I mean, what would you say? I mean, we're 1,200 people now.
Yeah.
Size-wise, if you look at the sizing of the basic units, you could probably get up to around close to 2,000 people with what's out there.
Okay.
The trickling filter is really the biggest thing, and it's based on volume. And so I indicated earlier, we wanted to make the new one a little bigger, so that gives you some population growth. And we'll look at that as we go forward. You
Yeah,
know,
that's,
If we,
When in doubt, you know, the primary clarifiers are not really size rated, they're not really population driven. So that, and neither is the digester, that's really driven by, you know, rehabbing it. So the one that really would be the most affected by wanting to build in a little growth would be the trickling filter. They come in 5-foot increments, and you know, if you look at that, if you add 5 foot to it, doesn't sound like much, but it gives you a lot of volume.
okay. I'm just,
Yeah, there's a lot of cubic feet in the outer 5 feet compared to the inner 5 feet.
if we look at a SRF for the disinfection project, and we would have to have this loan, say it's a $500,000 loan for that, and then we do the big plant project 2 or 3 years later on, does that $500,000 loan roll into the big loan then?
Probably not. It would be they would be side by side with a little different debt service schedule. But we can play with that as you go forward, because what some people do is they'll want to do a bridge. You know, if they can borrow, say, the money locally at a local bank for fairly cheap, they might go ahead and bridge that small project and then roll it into the bigger project, so you only end up with one loan. So as you go forward in it, there's some things that you can do. Typically, right now, most people would go get the two loans. Now, the loan payments are uniform. So in other words, they're basically uniform debt service payments. So you'd have one and then the other. So whether you got one or two really doesn't make a whole lot of difference on your loan payment. One would retire the back end a little bit earlier, but those are decisions that, as we go forward, you know, you can look at that and run the numbers on different options. But you can do one or two.
could you use a bridge loan from our electrical? Use
Yeah.
some of that money?
Yeah, if you want to do a bridge internally,
Potentially, yeah.
I mean,
because you're going to have, electrical always has at least some reserves for future that
Yes,
are available.
Yep, it's feasible.
I don't know, like I said, we have to take a look at numbers and stuff, but see where we're at, but, you know, then roll it back into
Right.
one major one, and then,
And you
because
just-
we need the reserves, we know what happens when we need the
Yeah.
reserves, so, went through that deal, so.
But, I mean, even if worse comes to worse, you know, you could, if you get everything in the system and worse comes to worse, and let's say you have a bad ice storm or something, and it taps out your electric reserves and you need to get it back, you can always pull the trigger on closing that loan a little earlier and get that replenished, so, you know, because we'll want to put the paperwork in the pipeline, even if you don't close the loan, so that you're on the list and approved for everything, even if you decide you want to kind of not get the loan closed till, because the loan interest only, it's a drawdown loan, so you only pay interest from the time you draw it down. So there's really, except for the little loan initiation fee up front, which is a 0.5 percentage point, there's really not much cost to actually get the loan, because you only really pay for it once you draw it down. So it's different than a normal bond issue that where you, here's the money, start paying interest. This one is you only pay when you borrow.
That's a good thought.
So I guess a couple things is that Bob needs to submit our facility plan and want to make sure that everybody's on board with that happening. The other thing that I would ask of Bob is that we would receive a engineering proposal from him, and that's be one of the next.
I think the next step, that
Ideas.
probably is down the road just a little bit. What I'd like to do is to get the planning and design loan, get that process going. You'll need a number, I'll have to give you a number.
I need a number, yeah.
Yeah, we'll give you a number, we won't act on it, but we'll work with, what I think is that in November or December, at one of those meetings, you can authorize the planning and design loan, and then we'll start that process.
Do we need a motion for him to submit the plan to, is that? the
Yeah, I think that would be good if we could accept the facility report.
So move. Second,
Second.
roll call.
Okay, Waltman.
Yes.
Stankin.
Yes.
Reese.
Yes.
Cleveland.
Yes.
And I hope
Motion
it gets
carried.
an hour.
Now, are all these made out of cement?
Typically,
They haven't come up with anything better.
not really. Not from a cost or durability perspective. I mean, there are some things, you know, for example, there's a trend back, you know, one of the things that we see, in some of these units that are below ground, go back, when I first got into business, we didn't used to put air in training like we used for pavement in below grade structures. And so they're more durable. And then we got going, we put air in pavement for freeze thaw. Well, it doesn't freeze and thaw down 10 feet below the ground inside the sewage tanks. And so entrained air actually weakens the concrete because it's got more voids in it.
It does.
Yeah. It does better up in pavement, but if you look at some of the older pavement that doesn't, older concrete that doesn't have air in it, that stuff is tough as,
I've looked at, when you
How
go
do you
through
not do
Dennison,
what?
How do you do that?
You just don't add air. We artificially add air to concrete so it doesn't break up when it freeze thaws. What happens is that up on the surface in streets where you get moisture, you need to have a place for the moisture to displace so it doesn't break the concrete when it freezes. So you put air bubbles in there so that it's got a place to do that. Down below ground, it doesn't freeze, doesn't thaw. And so you actually can have more durable, longer life concrete. So some of the things we're seeing now is trying to be more conscious of the lifespan of the tanks. You know, and so we don't end up with some of the erosion, a little bit thicker embedment on the concrete, so we don't have the re-steel out so close to the surface, so you don't get that moisture penetration. You know, whether you use epoxy bars, that's debatable, but there's some things that although we haven't come up with a better tank, we're going back and we're coming up with better tanks. So we're gonna get better, I think, much better lifespan out of it. We got better quality control on the concrete now if we just quit doing stupid things like putting air in it to hook or how.
I've seen where they put air in it and they had bricks that sit outside.
Yeah.
And the corners, the ones that didn't have air in it, the corners would like to rot off.
Right,
The other ones would be nice and square.
yeah, that's that's the moisture and the freeze thaw. But below ground, where it doesn't have a freeze and thaw, you don't have that. But that's why you put air in concrete, is to keep it, because if the freeze thaw, if you leave that one out there long enough, it'll all be gone. The other one with the air in, it'll stay there. That's how we keep our streets, but we're not, you know, tanks and streets are two different things.
Lon, I guess one of the questions I have for you, since you were down there every day and looking at it, what do you feel is a priority on the phase two?
The trickling filter and the digester, my opinion.
That's your,
Right now, I mean,
That-
because right now the digester ain't even working.
right, that's what I'm
You
saying.
know, probably the third thing would be the primaries. I disagree with Bob on the grit removal. I ripped the whole damn thing out of there. And I put a deal where I just drove a skid loader down in there and picked it up. Put it in a hopper and get rid of it.
We can still do that.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, we got, what we
it's
just put,
$380,000.
we put an allowance in there. You notice I was
Yeah.
pretty
We
vague.
can do it for $60,000. You know?
Just a question for you. How often would you have to do that with a skid loader?
Well, we used to, when I first started here, we scooped it out by hand. And we'd do it about 3 or 4 times a year. Go down there, sand shovel and scoop it out. We'd stand on the edge and scoop it out, throw it in the skid loader bucket. Well, at that time, we didn't even have a skid loader. We threw it in the tractor bucket and hauled it away, took it down to the dump. And right now, you're supposed to take it to a landfill.
Can't take it to the,
Can't take it to the dump. You got,
That's what I was gonna ask,
but,
where you want that?
the system that we have now, that we paid 300,000 for, and I ain't kidding you, the damn thing hadn't worked from day one. We fought it and fought it and fought it, and it kept plugging the pipe up down below. And it turned on I think it was every 15 minutes when it first started, and it would still plug up the pipe. Well, when I took over, I got that part working, we put a new tube in there for the suction deal, can't get it working, still don't work. And so I'm just like, why spend more money on a dead horse, you know?
Is that gonna make more, smell?
No, doesn't make smell, but when we cleaned the primary out, and worked on that, we did that ourselves and fixed that flight that was busted with just treated board, bolted to the fiberglass, and we took some links out of the chain so we could get the chain to stay on cause it's shot, but
stretches,
yeah, it's a plastic chain.
and it stretches, and so you gotta take
Yeah.
the links out.
So we took the links out, and we've got it working back again, but when we had sucked that down, there's 3 chambers in the front that he has lined in pink here. Them are completely full of grit, there's only 1 chamber out of the 3 that doesn't have grit in it. Because the valving system should have been replaced when they did, that was one of those things that just kinda got pushed back, well, they're working, well, they don't work. So there's 2 valves in there, well, one valve's open, the other ones don't work at all. Well, then, he don't have it in the drawing here, but on the top of the primary, the sludge that floats is supposed to be able to be skimmed off. They eliminated that. So we have to take fire hose in there all the time, and we just try to make it settle back out. We just spray it down and try and make it settle
Another
back out.
Band-Aid.
Yep.
There you go. I mean, I don't know why they took that out of there when they redid the plant,
So
but
if
they
you-
did.
If you hauled this manually, it would have to go to the landfill, you said?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we're talking.
It's not
You're not
much.
talking huge
You're
volumes.
talking, a half a skid loader bucket, maybe 3 times a year.
Oh, wow.
You probably get a little bit more than that, but you don't get
Yeah.
a huge
We'll
one.
talk
You won't get
about
huge
that.
quantity.
Can
Yeah.
you set it out on the corner somewhere and
The thing
then,
about
till
it
you get a
is-
load?
Yep. I
The thing
think-
about it is if we put the pump station in, because part of what you're getting right now is you're building up grit in the sewer, because the hydraulics coming, the sewer coming from town isn't ideal. If I get that sewer flowing better, I'll probably get more of the grit coming to the grit chamber, not piling up in the sewer, which isn't, that's also good, because that grit in the sewer reduces its capacity.
And that has helped since we lowered that sewer line 4 inches in there. I don't have, if I open up manhole now, I don't have grit in that sewer. So it is getting down there now. But, you know, there for a while, we were having to pump down by Minor Peterson's on a high flow because the water just couldn't get there. And, we haven't had that happen now since we've lowered that. Now, I don't know
And
if
clean the
that's-
sewer main, but yeah.
I don't think
Yeah, and we haven't had the water like we've had.
Yeah, you haven't made it, you've made it better, I don't think you've totally solved the problem.
I think you're right, yeah.
And so the pump station is designed to help, it's the same, its effect is the same thing as when we put the pump in,
Yeah.
except it's there.
Would this screw deal work in that grit removal? To lift that grit out of there?
No.
Because you gotta dewater it.
There is a screw for dewatering the grit.
Yeah.
It's a different screw.
Okay.
But I'll get you the information, there is a screw, there's a screw that's designed for dewatering the grit.
Yeah.
And so it basically pushes the grit up and lets the water run back along it. It's an enclosed tubular, so it's got an outside tube, whereas a normal sewage pump doesn't have the outside chamber, it's just an open Archimedes screw. But I'll show you that.
At least we've taken care tonight what we need to take care
So
of.
I'm gonna ask, to maybe get one signature from Scott for a piece of paper, and then I'm done. Thank you for the time this evening.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I got a feeling we're gonna see quite a bit of you.
Is that good or bad?
That's good.
Oh, you'll know if it's bad.
Anybody got anything else? Over here? Otherwise, we need a motion to adjourn.
I'll make a motion.
Second?
I'll second.
Meeting adjourned.
I never get to do that.
Tomorrow?